Good morning to everyone. I'm Dr. Vernon Smith from American Public University System, which of course includes American Military University and American Public University. We are the sponsors with the Policy Studies Organization of this third annual Space Education and Strategic Applications Conference. And we're kicking the conference off with a real highlight. And I think you will be surprised and not only surprised, but delighted at the knowledge that's here. Greatness doesn't happen on its own, as we know that greatness actually stands on the shoulders of others. And we have one of the greats with us today, Colonel Mike Mullane. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to Colonel Mullane, and then we'll turn it over to him to be able to do this. Now, the three important things that that he emphasized, but I pulled another that he thought was really important, and I have a nice bio here, but you know, he's a West Point graduate. And that's important. In 1967, a West Point graduate, but then he went to the Air Force, which is also really interesting. And we're glad he did, because it took him on the route that he's come. He's also a Vietnam veteran. And if you know about the dedication and other parts of the Vietnam era, that's an important aspect and something to be proud of. And then also known is that Colonel Mullane is also an astronaut. And you talk about those three things as a West Point grad, a Vietnam vet, and as well as an astronaut. Those are pretty impressive credentials. He also mentioned that, you know, not to say it with the astronaut, you know, he did 3 space missions on Discovery and Atlantis before retiring from NASA. And so lots of experience there. He's also an author and of several books, including his memoir, which we recommend to you, Riding Rockets, The Outrageous Tales of a Space Shuttle Astronaut. And we really recommend you that. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me with Colonel Mike Mullane. Mike, we're going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Vernon, very much. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my program, in which I'm going to discuss kind of an eclectic program. I'll mention my space shuttle missions. I'm going to talk a little bit about commercialization of space. There's a lesson to be learned, I think, on space policy and the Challenger disaster. So I'll mention that, and I'm going to give my life story on how I ended up being an astronaut. So let's begin. I want to take you vicariously into a space shuttle, space shuttle launch. Pretend we're astronauts. We're on this crew. We get to the pad. We walk across the access arm. We enter the white room where we dress in our harnesses. We get down on our hands and knees and crawl into the cockpit. There'll be technicians inside to help lay us back into our chairs. They will strap us to those chairs. And then as they leave, they will close the side hatch. The access arm will be retracted, and we will be left alone. And while we're awaiting launch, I'll tell you what, astronauts going to be in the grips of 2 fundamental emotions, one of which is gut fear. You will fear for your life out there. But at the same time that fear is on you, you're going to be boundlessly joyful, because for most astronauts, it's a lifetime quest to make this flight. So with that in hand, you're going to be overwhelmed with joy. At T-minus 6 seconds, the 3 liquid engines start. And that occurs, we get this heavy vibration in the cockpit. At T0, the hold down bolts blow, the solid rocket boosters ignite, and we're slapped into our seats with a force of about 2 Gs, 2 times gravity, as the rocket leaps off the launch pad. 2 minutes up, the boosters burn out and separate. That occurs, we hear a loud bang. We see a whip of fire across the wind screens as these things are blowing away. And now we continue into space on the 3 liquid-fueled engines, but from here on up, it's very smooth and quiet. The only way you can tell you're moving really is the G-force is slowly rising in your body, and those will stabilize at 3 Gs, 3 times the force of gravity. 8.5 minutes up, the autopilot shut off the engines. The gas tank was empty. It was jettisoned. All that remained now headed to orbit was the winged vehicle. And now, 8.5 minutes later, we're on our way to the International Space Station, where we will have the great good fortune of rendezvousing with George Clooney, Sandra Bullock, and we will get to pick up Matt Damon's autograph on his way back from Mars. All those Hollywood people beat us up into space. Okay, I want to now move in and tell you about the missions that I flew. I flew in the early shuttle program. My first mission was the 12th mission in 1984. We had 3 of these spinning communication satellites that we took up and released. Pretty pedestrian work compared to walking on the moon. I want to tell you what happened on my very first launch attempt in June of 1984. These 3 liquid engines start 6 seconds early so they can be checked by computer. If there's a problem, they'll be shut off. Because once you light those solid rocket boosters, there's no going back. You're absolutely committed to flight at that point. On the 11 previous missions, these 3 liquid engines started, passed all their tests, the rocket flew. Of course, we're out there on our mission. We get down to those final seconds, feel that rumble, that vibration in the cockpit, 5, 4, 3, silence. There was a problem with one of the engines, they all shut off. That was scary enough. I mean, we practiced for this, but just your mindset is once the engines start, you're going. But then what really ratcheted up the fear was the word fire. A fire developed at the bottom of the vehicle. And when you're on top of 4 million pounds of propellant and the word fire is mentioned, that really, really jacks up the heart rate. For a while, we thought we were going to have to do an emergency escape from the cockpit. If you ever wondered how that would work, we'd open up the cockpit ourselves, run across the access arm would be swung back into position. We'd run across that, jump in these escape baskets and ride those on a cable that would take us real fast, a quarter mile away from the vehicle and then, or from the launch pad. And then we'd jump out of those and they had an underground bunker that we could wait out the problem in. We did not have to do that. They turned on the fire suppression system, got the fire out, and we were extracted from the cockpit the normal way by a crew. But boy, that was, that put a, see, I have no hair. That's why I don't have any hair. Having things like that happen in my life. We came back 2 months later and got it into space with my first mission on the first flight of the Orbiter Discovery. That's the vehicle that's in the Air and Space Museum Annex up there in Washington, D.C. Okay, my second mission, there's a lesson. It was a secret military mission. I can't talk about the payload, but something happened on this mission. I think it's a good lesson for all of us, and that is to be curious, to be questioning, to be critical thinkers. This is obviously an engineering when I talk about what's coming up next, but it should be that way in all aspects of what we do. Just be critical thinkers and take it beyond the obvious and ask questions. So here's what I'm going to use to develop that point. During launch on this second mission, a couple minutes up or a minute up, the tip of the right side solid rocket booster broke off and shotgunned our heat shield on the lower right belly nose area and back down the length of the vehicle. We didn't see that, but the ground had cameras and saw that it had occurred. And when we finally were able to land, 5 or 6 days later, you could see all that white. Those are scars on the damage that was sustained to the heat shield. That's in a very hot part of the reentry, by the way. And after landing, they had to change out about 700 of these heat tiles. They were so severely damaged. Now, these blocks of silica that they have up there, they see about 2,300 degree heat on reentry. The leading edges of the wing have carbon panels. They see 3,000 degree heat in reentry, the highest temperatures on reentry. They're not silica blocks, they are carbon panels. They're very brittle. And so that's why we call the space shuttle a glass rocket. Well, we had a robot arm on this mission, and I was the robot arm operator, and NASA sent me, and there's a camera on the end of that robot arm. So the mission control sent the instructions for me to bend this thing at a crazy angle to put that camera down underneath there and survey the damage that we might have sustained. And of course, we saw all that scarring that you just saw in reentry, but there's no way to get back. Didn't matter how much damage there was. You have no options. You have to fly through this 3,000 degree reentry. Here's a view out the window of the orange glow of reentry. And if you look out the overhead window, the vehicle is coming in 40 degrees nose high, and this 3,000 degree plasma is wrapping around you. And that's a vortex of that plasma trailing off into infinity behind us. But when we landed, this is what really scared us. You're looking down 6 inches into that mosaic of black heat tiles where it sees 2,300 degrees. One of those heat tiles in a very high in that area was blasted completely free. You're looking down on the charred remains of the bottom of those of what was left of that silica block, and just right underneath those charred remains is aluminum. And had it reached that aluminum, it would have been the end of the vehicle. We would have disintegrated on reentry as Columbia did years later. Now, there were several lessons that could have been taken away from this near miss. One of which is the shuttle heat shield can take significant damage and still protect the vehicle. But there was another lesson, and that lesson was the shuttle heat shield is vulnerable to catastrophic damage from falling debris. We all took away this lesson right here, the wrong lesson. The shuttle heat shield can take significant damage and still protect the vehicle. After all, we just re-entered with 700 heat tiles damaged and one completely missing. Why wouldn't you take away this lesson? Well, this is where critical thinking and being curious comes in. Because I don't remember the second lesson is the one we should have taken, that, hey, the heat shield is very vulnerable to catastrophic damage from falling debris. And nobody, and I recall, ever critically thought or was questioning, curious about what would have happened if that debris had hit one of these carbon panels on the nose or the leading edge of our right wing. What would have happened then? As it was, the damage started just after that carbon nose cap and narrowly missed the right wing carbon panels. And had there been curiosity devoted to what would have happened had those carbon panels been hit, we might have been able 15 years later to avoid Columbia burning up on reentry, because it burned up as a result of debris shedding, insulation foam shedding off that gas tank 83 seconds up and striking the left leading edge wing of Columbia. And tests that were done after Columbia's loss, they fired foam from air cannons into some of these carbon panels, and you can see what the result was. So they estimate the size of the hole in the left leading edge wing of Columbia on reentry was 9 inches in diameter. That provided a pathway for 3,000 degree heat to enter into an aluminum vehicle that melts at 1,000 degrees. So the vehicle obviously was going to come apart under that type of a heat load. So just the message here is be a critical thinker, be curious and be questioning. Don't just get the tunnel vision on a specific thing that happened. Look beyond that and say, what if? And had we done that, like, what if we had sustained on 27 a carbon panel hit? Well, let's go and investigate that. Let's do some offline testing and see how vulnerable those carbon panels are to a kinetic impact like that. That was not done. Had it been done, we might have saved Columbia from being lost 15 years later. Critical thinking, folks, always apply it in everything you do. STS-36 was another secret military mission that I flew. I can't discuss that. I know, though, there's a lot of people out there, when they hear the shuttle was flying military payloads, secret missions, they're thinking we rendezvous with UFOs and aliens. And I can assure you we did not. But let me answer that question. It's one of the most popular I hear as a retired astronaut. Have I seen any aliens or UFOs? No. Do I believe there's alien life out in the universe? Yes, I do, given the number of stars that are out there. This is an estimate. There's some estimates even bigger than this, but that's pronounced 10 billion trillion stars. And to get your head around this, that's 10,000 stars for every grain of sand on the earth. And when I see numbers like that, I can't believe we're alone. I think there's going to be lots of intelligent civilizations elsewhere in the universe. I just don't believe they've come to visit Earth. I think if they ever do, they will land and make a significant, unambiguous contact. We'll all know they're here. I just have my doubts about all of it. I know there's been a lot of credible reports by Navy pilots. Those are hard for me to dismiss, but I still think that if an intelligent life form is coming to Earth, they would make a significant impact. But I always conclude with this. That's my opinion. That's all it is. It's not science. You have your own opinion. You can believe anything you want. If you think you've seen them or been kidnapped by them, I'm not going to say you haven't. Okay, let's talk briefly about the commercialization of space exploration. And this is a great lesson in the potential offered by challenging the status quo. Let's just briefly look back on how we got to commercialization of space. Those are big numbers for the shuttle program and getting that flag on the moon. Very expensive to fly vehicles into space, and the taxpayers, of course, have to assume that expense. So it's no surprise as the final shuttle launch was wrapping up, that people were looking ahead and say, hey, what about the future? Is there a way of getting into space cheaper for the taxpayer? And the technology had advanced to that point where there was a capitalistic incentive for businesses to want to have a piece of the action in space, because they could develop rockets and then sell their launch services to the private sector, make money, make profit for the shareholders. So that nexus of capitalism and the advancement of technology was what prompted the Obama administration in around 2008, I believe it was, somewhere in that area, 2010, to announce this privatization of low Earth orbit, that NASA would get away from the old model of building these vehicles to launch astronauts. They only flew a couple times. They were obviously purpose built for that. The infrastructure had to be maintained for these at enormous expense. So all of this was being borne by the taxpayers. So the ideas coming out of the Obama administration, let's now just give seed money, some taxpayer seed money, to these startup companies like SpaceX, like Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic. Let's give them some seed money. And then now in the future, we won't own any of that. Taxpayer doesn't have to pay for any of it. We'll just lease the service, the launch service, when we need it for our astronauts. Now, what do you suppose, probably most people at NASA, but certainly I'll bet 99%, probably all the astronauts, what do you think that we thought about this idea of commercializing getting astronauts into orbit? I wasn't at NASA. I left NASA in 1990, so I was well retired when this happened. But they got 25 NASA legends. I'm not a NASA legend. I'm talking about Gene Kranz and the surviving moonwalkers, and Chris Kraft, and all these legends of the Apollo program. Wrote a letter with documenting their concerns about this privatization of space exploration, human space exploration, to President Obama. And I would have signed this letter, and I imagine every astronaut would have signed this letter, because I felt exactly as these legends did. And here's a couple excerpts from this letter that went to President Obama. We see our human exploration program being reduced to mediocrity. Another comment, the privatization of rocket development is a terrible decision. The sky is falling. You can't do it. This will fail. I absolutely believe that, as did these 25 legends, and again, probably all astronauts did. We were in the vice grip of this syndrome. That's the way we've always done it. There's no other way you could do it. It has to be done by the taxpayers, like the old models from Mercury through the shuttle program. And why? Because fear of change fossilizes us. It's hard to change. It's hard to move to something so dramatically different from a taxpayer-based model into a private model like this. But when you do get fossilized, and I'm talking about change in anything, not just the space program, when you get fossilized in the status quo, there could be some really great opportunities that are being missed. And boy, did SpaceX prove that. In just 8 years, which is light speed in rocket development, the SpaceX, Musk and his company had developed new engines. That's unheard of in that fast, to develop new engines. They developed this SpaceX Heavy vehicle, and they perfected this vertical landing and reusability feature. They developed the Dragon capsule, which is now being flown regularly with NASA astronauts to the International Space Station. He's working on this gigantic 400-foot tall, 10 million pound Starship down there in South Texas that has a reusable second stage. I guess you could say the shuttle had a reusable second stage because it came back and landed. But no, right now there are no other players in that field. All the rockets that launch, SpaceX gets the first stage back for reuse, but the second stage burns up like it does for all the other rockets that are out there. By the way, look at the size of this thing in scale. See those cranes down there? There's some construction going on here in my hometown at a very large hospital being built. And I see those cranes out there. They look gigantic. They look like toys when it's put up next to this Starship. Incredibly large vehicle. Of course, it hasn't flown yet. It's still in the developmental stage. And Musk talks about flying to Mars. I think this is a little bit of a dream right here. I sure wouldn't know to be sitting out there when one of these things landed. I imagine you get a little dust storm there. A lot of red dust could be coming at you when one of these things land. And Artemis, of course, is coming up. Hopefully that'll be launching here September 27th. They're in some tanking tests now. The first flight of the unmanned, but it's going to be launching that capsule to the moon and for a couple weeks up there and testing it through the whole regime of flight to the moon and back and re-entering the atmosphere, so that it can clear the way for using it a couple years later for manned missions. I should say human missions to the moon, because certainly there will be a woman and a person of color that will be walking on the moon on this next flight. NASA has made that clear. So Artemis is coming up. SpaceX has won the contract for the lander for that. This is the Apollo lander, but I believe in the concept drawings that I've seen, it's going to be similar to this for the lunar lander that SpaceX is developing, but it's going to be much bigger and be able to, I think, take 4 people to the moon and stay there longer. I believe that's all in works right now. So let's go back to these comments that were in that letter to President Obama. In contrast that with what has happened in the last 12 years since this policy was implemented. I mean, that is light speed. What I just covered here just doesn't happen that fast under the old model that we did things at NASA. And NASA admits this. NASA has said to get where SpaceX is would have cost billions more doing it under the older model. It would have taken much, much longer. So this has turned out to, obviously be a case that we were absolutely wrong in these doubts that we had about this sea change from taxpayer funded, taxpayer owned to now leasing the services of private operators. But in all fairness, change can be a bumpy ride. SpaceX didn't just do all of this without its problems. Developing this reusability feature, this vertical reusability feature, didn't come easy. They ended up crashing a lot of these things on this barge out there in the ocean before they perfected that vertical landing. They also had a notable failure here. They had another one that failed during launch, lost a satellite on that. So it was a bumpy ride to get where they get. But now they are reaping the benefits of tenacity, of pushing through these changes, of learning from these failures and pushing because of the reusability feature of their rockets. They've actually, the Falcon rocket put Boeing's Delta rocket out of business. That's gone. And they've also put the rest of the launch market in a mode of trying to catch up. I'm talking about the European, the Russian, the legacy carrier here in the U.S., the United Launch Alliance. They don't have a reusability feature for the rockets, so they're struggling to try to compete with NASA, compete with SpaceX on price point. This was an Aviation magazine article from a few years back talking about the SpaceX Heavy. They concluded it can carry twice the weight for less than 1/3 of the price of its nearest competitor. Now, Elon Musk says it's game over for all other heavy lift rockets, and he's probably right there. That they, I think SpaceX now is on their close to their 50th mission for this year. Of course, a lot of that is launching those Starlink satellites. But the point is that people can't compete with the reusability feature that SpaceX developed by embracing the attitude of, hey, there's a better way than the old way, and perfecting that reusability feature. I know that they are trying to introduce reusability features on these legacy carriers at United Launch Alliance. But again, these things can't be done overnight. It takes a long, long time to do this. Now let's talk briefly about the Challenger disaster. I think there's a lesson here in space policy. So I just want to touch on this. I'll go back to this number here. Where did the shuttle come about? Well, this was our first attempt. The shuttle was the first attempt to bring down the cost of operating in space. Didn't work out that way for the taxpayers, but that was based on this number right here. That the Apollo program was took an incredible amount of money to get humans on the moon. As the final shuttles as the final Apollo missions were playing out, NASA was looking ahead and reacting to Congress, obviously. Congress was saying, hey, we're no longer going to fund NASA, the manned program, at these lavish levels we did during the Apollo program to beat the Russians to the moon. That's going to dry up. So you need to think about how you're going to be able to get your astronauts into space cheaper in the future, because of your budget's going to be drawn down from the Apollo era. And so NASA answered that call with the space shuttle. Hey, it will make a reusable vehicle that through redundancy, it would come back and land on a runway, be reused. That's going to save a bundle of money. And through aircraft and through redundancy and testing, we would make this vehicle have aircraft-like qualities of safety, reliability, maintainability, turnability, things like that. Basically, NASA envisioned a high-flying UPS delivery vehicle, like a 747. It just happened to fly higher in orbit, but it still would have that type of operating aircraft-like safety, maintainability, reliability, etc. It'd be cheap to operate, cheap to turn, fast to turn between missions, and it would capture all of the launch market, all these varied demands on taxpayer rockets. Hey, we'll combine all that into one vehicle, the space shuttle. That's going to save some money. But it required the space shuttle to be flying and flying often to do this. So the model was the shuttle would rapidly build to 24 missions a year flight rate, about a mission every 2 weeks. NASA found themselves, though, under tremendous schedule pressure that really hadn't, I don't believe, existed back in the Apollo program. There was pressure there. The president said, let's get to the moon before the end of the decade. That's definitely pressure. But, I think NASA, it was more of an open-ended pressure, because if NASA wasn't going to jeopardize astronauts going to the moon. If they weren't ready, they weren't going to launch it. So they had that luxury of a more open-ended program in the Apollo. Now they don't, not with the shuttle program, because they're running a launch business. They're launching all of these different satellites. They're parallel planning. Used to be serial planning for these Apollo missions and earlier missions. They poured all their resources in more or less serially to get these things up in space and get them back safely and move on to the next one. Well, now they have to parallel plan multiple missions simultaneously with different payloads, different software, parallel crew training. So this was a sea change for NASA. They found themselves running a launch service business where schedules were critically important. For a satellite, if there's a communication satellite owner that wants to put their satellite in orbit, and NASA says, sorry, we're running late, we can't do it, that's costing that customer millions of dollars a day to have their satellites sitting on the ground. Department of Defense, if they say, hey, we want to launch on this date and you don't have the rocket available to launch us, you've jeopardized national security. So these things, this new era of the shuttle and a launch service business brought tremendous schedule pressure to the NASA contractor team. And the Rogers Commission, which investigated the Challenger disaster, concluded this. This is testimony from the Rogers Commission about the schedule pressure the team was working under. This is a contractor now. The problem was the increasing launch rate. We were just getting buried under all this stuff. The system was about to come down under its own weight. One of the things that happened here is that the shuttle turned out to not be easy to turn between missions. It consumed huge amounts of resources. There was spare parts were limited. So we found ourselves having to cannibalize the just landed orbiter to pull out a black box to put it on the next rocket that's getting ready to launch. So now that ripples downstream and you've doubled your workload there. So you had this tremendous schedule pressure building because of the difficulty of turning the shuttle between missions. It wasn't like a 747 landing on at an airport. Here's more testimony from the Rogers Commission, contractor testimony on what this schedule pressure was doing. I've worked as many as 23 hours in a day and many times 15 hours a day. And I work on Saturdays and Sundays. I've been called at 2 a.m. to get in your car and go to work. This is a Morton Thiokol contractor that did the solid rocket boosters. Here's another Morton Thiokol contractor. I, for one, resent working at full capacity all week and then being required to support activity on the weekend. So you can see that this shuttle program and trying to meet that launch rate of a mission every 2 weeks was just crushing the NASA contractor team. The program was built on the idea that rapidly the shuttle would come to that 24 missions a year flight rate that would be easy to turn. And that proved incorrect. In the meantime, as all the schedule pressure was on the team, a very serious engineering problem developed. These boosters are reused. They were reused. They parachuted back in the ocean, recovered. When the boosters from the second mission recovered, they found a burned O-ring, which the engineers understood that represented a significant threat to the astronauts and to the mission. Let me give you a little background. Many of you may not be familiar with O-rings, so let me give you a little background here what I'm talking about. These boosters were so big they could not be made in one solid piece. They were made in 4 propellant-filled pieces that were stacked together and bolted together. Now, when these things ignited, they burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel boils at 5,000 degrees, and that's what these boosters were made out of, steel. So they had insulating material that ran the inside length of these things to insulate the steel from that fire that it contained. The obvious weak point in the design is where you bolted these segments together, because there you have a potential leak path for the gas to pass to the outside, melt the steel, and cause a catastrophe. Now, I'm not going to go into the detailed engineering specifics of the design that was intended to prevent such gas leakage from these joints, other than to say it was based on a redundant flexible O-ring scheme. 2 flexible O-rings, 12 feet in diameter, sat in grooves at the perimeter of each of these segment joints to form a redundant steel-to-steel pressure seal. Your plumbing at home have O-rings to form a steel-to-steel pressure seal to prevent water leakage. Same principle. On the boosters, it was to prevent that hot gas from leaking out. Now people might think, oh my gosh, rubber, that's going to melt. But hey, there's as long as there's a seal there, that gas in that tube can only go out the bottom of the rocket. It can't go to the side. So as long as at least one of those is forming a seal, that gas is going out the bottom of the rocket. On Challenger, both O-rings failed on the bottom segment of the right side solid rocket booster at ignition. See that black smoke? That's the vaporized O-rings being shoved out that bottom joint. You now have 5,000 degrees eating into the outer wall of that booster. The rocket flies higher. The gas is vaporizing a bigger and bigger hole in the side of the booster rocket. 73 seconds up, the rocket comes apart, killing the 7 astronauts. Very tragic, obviously. And I want to make this point. This was a known problem. That damage was first seen after Flight 2. There were 12 of 24 missions before Challenger flight returned O-rings that showed O-ring 12 of 24 missions before Challenger boosters were returned that showed O-ring deviances, serious O-ring deviances that threatened the mission and the crew. And you could see the concern that the engineers had and what they were seeing with this design issue. Here's a memo that was written by a contractor, Mr. Roger Bougele, a Morton Thiokol contractor, 6 months before Challenger, where he expresses his concern about what they were seeing with these burned O-rings. And this is a very prophetic sentence here, and it was written 6 months before Challenger. It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem with the field joint, and that's the O-ring problem, we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight, a crew, and all the launch pad facilities. So Mr. Bougele's prediction was only off 73 seconds. He thought the rocket was going to blow up the launch pad, destroy the vehicle, kill the crew, and take out the launch pad facilities. So you think to yourself, well, why didn't NASA stop? Why didn't they fix the problem? That didn't happen for 4 years, 23 missions, 12 of which brought back damaged O-rings. Flights continued. From what was seen on Flight 2, the same process resulted in destruction of Challenger on Flight 25. Now, I cannot go into all of the decision-making and the rationalization that were used to continue flight. It was a process called normalization of deviance. It would take hours to go through all of that. But suffice it to say, the pressure that was on the team because of their limited resources seriously complicated the NASA contractor team to responding to this burned O-ring issue. And that's where and you can see that, by the way, in this House committee conclusion, that NASA's drive to achieve a launch schedule of 24 flights per year created pressure throughout the agency that directly contributed to unsafe launch operations, that being that they continued flying with a known serious design issue with those O-rings. And again, it was that schedule pressure that was seriously complicating their response to this O-ring issue. So if I had to summarize the root cause of the shuttle program in one sentence, it would be this right here. the Challenger. If I could summarize in one sentence what caused the Challenger disaster, it would be this single sentence right here. The shuttle program was overpromised and underfunded. That's what caused Challenger, is that people were trying to do too much with too little. And as I said, that complicated their response to a serious engineering problem. So the message I think that you should apply to, not just in space policy, but in any policy, is I think it would be important that there be adequate resources to achieve the goals that are being established, including reserve resources to cover unexpected problems. NASA did not have that. They didn't have those reserves. Everything was success oriented. The shuttle would be exactly what NASA had promised. It would be easy to turn. Well, that didn't develop. Pressures developed, complicating a response to a serious problem, and that brought about Challenger. And also, it's another lesson in continuous risk management. And these policies are set, make sure they're monitored and the risks continually managed. Now, we got a few minutes here yet, so I'm going to tell you my life story. A lot of people wonder how in the world I became an astronaut, so I'll go ahead and conclude with that, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. I was born 3 weeks after World War II, so I grew up as a very young, impressionable boy in the dark shadow of World War II. My dad was a World War II aviator. He regaled me and my brothers with these stories about the adventures that he had in World War II. Also, as I was a very impressionable 4, 5, 6-year-old boy, Hollywood was turning out these movies about the heroics of our World War II airmen. And boy, did I want to be one of them. That's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a jet. Well, at this time they developed jets too. I wanted to be a jet plane fighter pilot. Simultaneously, in the early 50s, Hollywood started churning out these science fiction movies about how astronauts are someday going to fly to the moon and to distant planets. And boy, I was all in on that. I love these science fiction movies, going to the Saturday matinees in town and seeing those. Then when I was 12 years old, Sputnik was launched. So you can see I was immersed in aviation and space very early in my life. When Sputnik was launched, I was all in. I wanted to be one of these guys. I wanted to be an astronaut, a John Glenn or an Alan Shepard, and ride rocket ships into space. In fact, I wrote a letter to NASA as a 12-year-old, probably about 13-year-old boy, when NASA was trying to develop a manned response to Yuri Gagarin, but their satellites or the rocket engines weren't powerful enough. I wrote a letter to NASA suggesting that they pick skinny little kids like myself to fly in these capsules. That would save weight and allow us to get somebody in orbit to answer Russia's manned orbiting program. Obviously, I didn't get any. I did get a nice reply from NASA and a lot of nice photos, color photos, but obviously they didn't decide to enlist me into the astronaut corps at age 13 or 14. Okay, I was growing up in Albuquerque, New Mexico at this time. I had vast desert right outside my door where I could indulge my interest in homemade rocketry. It wasn't so much rocketry as pipe bombs with fins. It's amazing I didn't blow myself to hell and back with these things. Here's my sophomore year of high school science fair project on how rockets might one day parachute back to Earth from space. Here I am on the roof of my parents' house testing a parachute extraction system for my capsule. By the way, my capsule was a Maxwell House coffee can. My nose cone was a rolled up piece of acetate plastic taped into a pointy shape. Here's that test. The parachute that's coming out there being deployed, that's the plastic from the dry cleaning with kite string as the shroud lines. Sometimes I use my dad's car as a wind tunnel. If I saw this today, I'd call 911. Notice the safe use of this step ladder. That's why I label this brainless teenager, because that's what I was. Here I am setting up one of my creations for launch out in the deserts of New Mexico, near my home in Albuquerque. Here I am legging it out after lighting a fuse. That's called hazard mitigation teenager style. There's ignition and there's detonation. You know, people here I flew in Vietnam, combat in Vietnam, flew 3 times on the shuttle, and they think, wow, look at all that danger you lived in your life. Trust me, the most dangerous period in any man's life isn't whatever we do as adult men. It's when we're teenage boys. When we're teenage boys, we don't have a brain in our skulls. Exhibit A, right here. Here's one of my successful launches, and here's one of my rockets parachuting back to Earth, to the desert. Here I am recovering one of those rockets. This video loops here. I want you to notice the young woman, about 19 years old, walking off the screen to the right there. That is now my wife of 55 years. There's a woman who will never be able to say, I didn't know what I was getting into. Not when I have video like that. Okay, going back to my science fair project, sophomore science fair project, I want to share with you the first two sentences of the report I wrote for this project. The first sentence read, today, and this was 1960, this country and many others throughout the world are steadily working toward the conquest of space. Then I continued in the second sentence and said, someday I also plan to participate in this great undertaking. I was 14 years old when I wrote that sentence. 25 years later, at age 39, I'm floating around in the cockpit of Discovery on my rookie space shuttle mission. Now, that is a dream come true by any human's definition. And I suspect right now, many of you watching are thinking to yourself, well, of course it happened to you, Melaine. You were lavishly gifted. You were a genius child. You had incredible talents. It was easy for you to become an astronaut. Well, let's dive into that. Here's my high school senior yearbook entry. And down in ambition, it says to attend the Air Force Academy. I couldn't get into the Air Force Academy. My grades weren't good enough. West Point took me, which frankly doesn't say a lot about West Point, does it? But in all fairness to West Point, they selected me as a third alternate. I barely got into West Point, and at graduation West Point, I wasn't on the stage getting awards for academic excellence. So destiny did not have genius to work with. Let me show you a few other things that destiny struggled with. This is the varsity club of my high school, the star athletes of my high school. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not in this picture. I was no star athlete. I didn't date the prom queen or the homecoming queen. I wasn't elected to student government. And this next slide says that all you need to know about my youth, the dedication pages out of my senior high school yearbook. I have one dedication and it reads, you missed Korea, but here's hoping you make Vietnam. That is the only dedication I have in my entire high school yearbook. What does that say about popularity? So it does beg the question, how did this geeky, nerdy kid end up being an astronaut? Well, I look back on it now and realize I had a couple things going for me. Didn't know it at the time, but I can see in retrospect I did. One was that from a very early age, I had laser focus on aviation and space. I knew exactly that someday I would be involved in the aviation in the space world. I wasn't exactly sure how. I didn't know the education was required, but I guarantee that's my life focus right there at a very young age. This is a blessing because I never saw it in any of my kids. Never see it. I haven't seen it in any of my grandkids. My kids say they never saw it with any of their friends. They don't know anybody like this. And I think it is incredibly rare when a child has such a focused interest early in life. And I'd have to say that is a blessing of the first magnitude. So I had this intense focus. And I also ended up with an abundance of tenacity. And I know where I learned that. I learned it from my parents. My dad, as I said, was a World War II aviator. He met and married my mom in the middle of the war when she was 18 years old. My dad survived the war to come back and live the American dream with my mom. But then in 1955, he stayed in the Air Force after the war, and we were stationed at Hickam Air Base in Hawaii. And in 1955, at age 33, my dad was crippled for life with polio. Never again walked, spent the rest of his life on crutches and braces and in a wheelchair. This time in my parents' lives, they had 6 kids to raise. And looking back on it, I can see now it was their heroic response to the challenges of polio, of raising 6 kids with the primary breadwinner confined to a wheelchair at a time in America, 1955, where impaired people are not highly valued. It was that sheer tenacity, that will to press through the obstacles that polio presented, that tenacity was imprinted on me. I was only 10 years old when all this was going down, but I'm certain I was imprinted with this sense of tenacity, of pushing through difficulty. And so now I have focus and I have tenacity. Well, in and of themselves, that doesn't do anything for you because I was lacking something. I had no faith in myself. I was terrified of failure. I didn't try out for sports. I didn't run for student government. I didn't ask girls out on dates. I was afraid of failure, of rejection. So I didn't try. So what happened? West Point happened. I owe my life to a lot of people, my parents, obviously, but I mean, I owe a significant part of my life to West Point because they opened my eyes to just how deep my reserves are, what I could do when I was challenged, and I could challenge myself. At West Point, if you want a mountain of hurt to fall on you, and anybody that's ever been in the military, been to boot camp, will know what I'm talking about. If you want a mountain of hurt to fall on you, say this: I can't, I'll fail, it's too hard. You learn right away, or I did as a plebe at West Point. You never say these. You do try. You won't fail many times. Sometimes you do. You learn from that. You press ahead. So that made all the difference in my life. So I graduated from West Point with the rocket fuel for life in the form of focus, tenacity, and a belief in myself that I could reach the next level. Got married a week after graduation from West Point. My wife, 9 months later, gave birth to boy-girl twin sets. This was, by the way, before the age of ultrasound. So you talk about a surprise. They had another child, third and last child, in 1971. In 1968, I entered flight training. This was right out of West Point, and left the babies and the wife at home in 1969 and went to war in Vietnam. I was flying in the back seat of the reconnaissance version of the F-4 Phantom, a Goose. That's what I was in my Air Force career. You saw Top Gun, Maverick, and Goose. I was a Goose. I was flying photo reconnaissance, so we flew alone, very fast, very low level over enemy targets, filming those for the intelligence people. Cold War forces in 4 years in England, and graduate school, get a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. If you would have told me before in high school that someday I'd have a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, I would have said, no way. It terrified me to go back to school and get this degree. But again, that focus and tenacity carried me through, and this was necessary as it ultimately turned out to apply to be an astronaut. Went to the backseater course at test pilot school, again, a very tough course. So it was these three things here: focus, tenacity, and a belief that I could elevate myself, challenge myself to a next level, that ultimately made me competitive to be an astronaut. It did not guarantee I'd be an astronaut. It made me competitive to be an astronaut. And the lesson I'd like you to, final lesson here to take away from this story is you don't have, folks, you do not have to be extraordinary to achieve extraordinary results. But it does take this. It takes focus and tenacity and a belief in yourself to achieve extraordinary results. And I will wish you all Godspeed on your life journeys. So let's now I'm going to stop sharing here, and we will then go ahead and let Vernon moderate a Q&A session here. Okay, Vernon.
Well, first of all, this has just been a fantastic presentation. Wow, you've brought so many things together, and with your life and connecting to things, there's nothing better to have a presentation that connects space, the vastness of space, down to your own personal life. And more than that, a motivational question and suggestions for everyone. The first question we got in here, Mike, actually does with your last part of your talk. The question is from Trevor Canfield, who says, what is the best way for leaders currently working in a non-space careers to transition and integrate themselves into a space-related career? What are the biggest challenges one would face in that process, and how likely is that a person can provide a meaningful impact in their new career field?
Well, I guess if the person's asking that question does not have a engineering or science type of degree, are there other opportunities? Obviously, the opportunities are wider if you're talking about having an engineering or science degree. I'm sure, I know for a fact that Blue Origin, for example, I have a friend of mine that's working on the Artemis program at NASA, and he says that Blue Origin has been recruiting away a lot of people from NASA, and so there's a big demand for engineers that are working in the space field. But if you don't have an engineering science degree, I'm sure there are other areas within these companies, public relations, other type of non-engineering type of slots that you could try to fit yourself into. I'm really not familiar with what those might be, but I'm sure if you go to the major players in the industry, the Blue Origin, the SpaceX, the Virgin Galactic, NASA, you go to these people and see what type of openings that they have out there where they're recruiting, and definitely then throw your name in and see if you can't get in there.
That's a great answer. Mike, related to that, so making the connections, looking at the industry, it's more vast than what we may put in our minds.
Well, yeah, and someday, I mean, someday you're going to have tourist industries in space where they're going to have a space station and people fly up there and go to spas or spa in space type of thing. You will have more and more people that aren't engineering and science related that are running businesses for what we would say are normal type of people. They're not rocket scientists. So the employment opportunities are going to increase vastly as we get further and deeper into this tourism in space, commercialization of space. So obviously, if you're young out there, the opportunities are going to develop. And for those people who are still maybe in their studies, you might see what's out there and look for a major in that area, in marketing or accounting or whatever it is that they're looking that is not engineering or science related. Obviously, STEM, I think, is going to have a lot more opportunities in employment in the space industry right now. And so if you're oriented toward that, you're going to have plenty of opportunities.
Mike, you did a master's degree in this. What impact do you think that master's degree and that other study went there? That's the first part of the question. What impact did that have on you overall? But what are some of the things that when you're doing your master's degree, you wish you had paid more attention to back when you were a middle schooler at 14 years old?
Well, the master's degree proved critical to being competitive for the astronaut program. When I applied to be an astronaut, there were two things on my application. One was a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and the other was having graduated from the backseater course at test pilot school. They call that a flight test engineer school. NASA, if you looked at the announcement that NASA had for selecting astronauts, I was selecting the first group of shuttle astronauts in 1978. But if you looked at the announcement back in 1976 on that for applications, you didn't have to have a master's degree. It just said you had to have a bachelor's degree, at least a bachelor's degree in science or engineering. And they listed some of the things, what defining science and engineering. And so when I get there and ultimately get selected, almost every one of the military people, about half of our group is military, about half was civilian. And you look at the military people, almost everybody had a master's degree. And if you look at the civilians, now there was no mention other than a bachelor's degree. Most of the civilians had PhDs and doctorates in various sciences, astrophysics, geology, oceanography, medical doctors, those type of sciences. So they had doctorates. So I think it was very critical that I have that master's degree as a military person to compete with the other people that had that same master's degree. And if I was out there and if you're in middle school or something right now, and you're looking forward someday to getting your science or engineering degree, you're going to have to hit the math real hard, folks. Really get as much as you can, move up as fast as you can, and differential equations and calculus and all that. Just soak that all in, because it's needed for every one of these courses that you're taking out there. I remember I had been out of West Point for 6 years when I decided to go back to graduate school, and here I was out flying, and all of that math had just kind of evaporated in my head that I learned at West Point. West Point was really big on engineering. I mean, I don't think we ever. And when I was at West Point, I don't think in my senior year we might have had 1 or 2 electives. Other than that, everybody got the exact same course. It was heavy in engineering and science, and most of that was gone, it seemed. But when I walked in the door at graduate school, my knees were shaking together. I was thinking, oh, how am I going to recapture all of this? But it took about a month before I started recapturing it all.
So it gets in there. So great advice for folks coming on. Another question we have, this is from Mike Gray, saying, I do understand the benefits of private capital for the development of space technology, but do you have any thoughts or concerns regarding balancing private versus public interest?
Private versus public interest. I guess I'm not really sure. I mean, if you're saying, I'm not really sure.
Would the use, I think another way of saying it, I hope I get this right, Mike Gray, in this is that in this exchange are the public interests being protected in using private carriers?
Okay, well, I guess I'm trying to think of an example of, where
Certainly you mentioned
we have to
cost.
remember that
Certainly,
these companies got taxpayer seed money, so they kind of owe us something. And so if all of a sudden they held the Department of Defense hostage and say, we're not going to launch unless you double down on how much you're paying us to launch your satellites, obviously that's not in the public interest to be blackmailed by a carrier. That's not going to happen. I mean, there's competition out there between the companies. In fact, actually, when SpaceX won the contract for the lunar lander on the Artemis program, Bezos and Blue Origin sued, wanted that rebid. They felt they should have had a better design or a cheaper design. Actually, they did come in much cheaper, but on their proposal. But NASA felt more comfortable going with SpaceX. But at any rate, so there's competition out there. When there's competition, the public interest is generally going to be protected. You don't have monopolies built. I guess I'm not that familiar with that. I mean, it's kind of out of my realm, protecting the public out there. But I'm sure there will be something that will develop that will kind of reflect back on hey, these guys are not doing it to the public interest. I don't know what that might be right now, but maybe it can happen in the future. Right now, I would think that if I was a taxpayer, I'd be cheering at what I'm seeing there with SpaceX. NASA now is renting those services, and doesn't own those rockets, doesn't own the infrastructure. So the taxpayer, I think it was a great move.
Absolutely. A quick question, and I don't know if it's a quick answer, but policy groups have voiced concern in legal terms regarding the civilian sector controlling the military agenda and strategic environments, right? The theater and space, right? And then they said, yet the Sherpas are all very open to corporate sector development. Is there what new policy sandbox would assist in co-creative group work? And I guess that's the idea of bringing military and commercial together.
Well, I mean, the military is using the assets being provided by SpaceX. In fact, I just saw recently where they signed I think it was like a $4 billion contract to launch 5 DoD satellites over the next couple of years. And as far as the control of military assets in space in our country, those are controlled by the Department of Defense is controlled by the Secretary of Defense, who is appointed by the president. It's under civilian control. All our military is, including those space assets. So nothing's being done in space by our military that isn't being controlled by the elected civilians that are out there, beginning with the president. A lot of that other stuff I'm just not familiar with that you were asking me. It's just,
well, I'm not necessarily.
It's not an equation. It's not an equation. I'm struggling here to deal with some of the lingo that I'm hearing.
Well, during the next couple of days, I'm sure we're going to have sessions that will go into deeper on that. Mike, I want to let you know that we've got an overwhelming response that I've received so far of just very appreciative, saying that this was an excellent presentation. It was inspiring, and it really framed things well for and humanizing what we're doing in not only from your life experience, from what we're doing and where we're pointing to go. I just want to thank you, deeply for taking the time out of your schedule to be able to join us and do this. And of course, this thank you for letting us record this. We plan on sending this to middle schoolers wherever we can, those STEM kids or that are interested in that area, and also saving for the future. So again, thank you for your time. And we really appreciate being part of the Space Education and Strategic Applications Conference.
Well, thank you very much, Vernon and Daniel. And I really enjoyed sharing the stories with you. And I hope has a positive impact on the youth. I really do. At least watch the end of it about my life story and take those lessons to heart there about focus, tenacity, and a belief in yourself. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.